Mary Kissel is the moderator of the Nixon seminar. She was a former senior official in Mike Pompeo's Department of State. She is also now with Stevens, and she joins me this morning. Good morning, Mary. You're looking very red this morning for our discussion of the red Chicoms. Good morning.
That's right. Good morning, Hugh. It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Mary, could you explain for people what you are doing now that you've left the State Department in addition to moderating the Nixon seminar?
Right. Well, my day job is I'm executive vice president, senior policy advisor at Stevens, which is one of the country's largest family-owned financial services firms. So I talk to some of the country's biggest investors, CEOs, boards of directors about what's going on in the world. And I'm also vice chairman of RXO. It's a New York Stock Exchange listed company. So those are my jobs.
Now, Mary Kissel, one of the things that I love is I get your Stevens report. You're kind enough to share that with me. And when I read your report this week about the disappearance of a high-ranking Chinese official, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and I'll let you explain who got gone where, I asked you if I could share it, and you said sure. And if you want me to talk about it, so I jumped at the chance. I didn't realize you would get up early and do radio and television with me over on the Salem News Channel. Can you explain us first who disappeared, when, and why that was an alarm for you and investors?
Right. So I try to give investors frameworks for how to understand the world. And oftentimes they've completely divorced politics and economics because they simply felt that they didn't have to pay attention to the regimes in which they were investing. And so the disappearance of China's foreign minister, Qin Gong, was largely ignored on Wall Street. And I think that's wrong because it speaks to the nature of the regime. This isn't a one off. This regime, over the span of its short life, has often had some significant political turmoil at the top that impacted policy and that impacted us. And we have very little insight to it. So Qin Gong hasn't been seen since June 25th. He was not the top ranking official, but he was one of the top ranking officials. And it came close on the heels of a huge shakeup in China's nuclear, in rocket forces rather, as well, where you had two of those top leaders removed from their post with very little warning. So investors have to understand this is not a capitalist regime. They have none of the characteristics that we enjoy: no property rights, no rule of law, no stability here. And recall too that Xi Jinping himself disappeared for several weeks at the beginning of his premiership. Nobody knew where he was. So we have to look at what they do to understand the trajectory of that country. And I'm telling investors to get out of there. If you're there and you can't leave immediately, then start diversifying right now and get out. I lived in Hong Kong for many years. I was the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal's pages out there. And I've seen this coming for a very long time, Hugh.
Mary Kissel, when I originally sat down with you the first time and you kind of opened my eyes to what was going on, I was one of those, I don't want to call us stooges, I was one of those optimists who believed that capitalism would change China. The trajectory of that is no longer even relevant. That's just not what's going on there. Xi Jinping wants to be Mao 2.0. Indeed, I fear he wants to be greater than Mao. Greater meaning not only get Taiwan, but win another war with the West, just like Mao won the Korean War. I'm sure you read Chairman Gallagher's piece with Aaron McLean on the lessons they remember from Korea. Let's bring it down to the investor level. I am out of China, and I sat on exactly one investment committee in my entire life, and I raised the question, should we have any money in China? And the answer was, it's not enough to really expose our fund. But I really, at this point, I think it's just gambling.
Well, I think that the West has been propagandized for 40 years. And just the idea that you would ever call China capitalist is totally ridiculous. China didn't ever embrace capitalism. The country almost fell apart during the Cultural Revolution. They effectively had no choice. And Xi Jinping was never a reformer. He used the West and our foreign direct investment to his own ends. I'm very glad to see the China Committee investigating the funds that are essentially funneling U.S. Money into China's PLA and to other organs that are aimed straight at us. But again, you think about the phrases that you hear bandied about on Wall Street, that they're long-term thinkers, that they want a win-win proposition, that they have some sort of Chinese form of capitalism. It's all ridiculous. And I'm amazed. I'll sit in front of investors, fewer today, but many still believe that there's some sort of rapprochement on the horizon, and that's simply not true. You need to go back to basics. You need to look for places where you have a predictable transfers of power, where you have a real arbitration and fair arbitration in courts, where you have independent boards of directors. China has none of those things.
Mary
It's incredible
Kissel,
we ever
the
invested
reason
there in
that
the first place.
I think the reason that investors are confused is they see Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, go to Beijing. They see the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, go and kowtow, actually bow 3 times to her counterpart. Then they see John Kerry go, and they come back with nothing. But if our people are going there, are they drawing the erroneous conclusion that they're getting something done? Because I don't think they're getting anything done. Nothing.
Right?
Zero. Am I correct? Or
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And what's remarkable is that when I talk to corporate leaders or boards, in fact, I was just out talking to a bank in California who was highly levered to China. They get it. And so, for the first time in many, many decades, you see Washington on an opposite trajectory from corporate America, where corporate America gets it. They're trying to get out. Even Apple's trying to get out and diversify, while Washington is pushing them to get back in. And that's simply unsustainable. And I think, unfortunately, this administration is trying the approach of the Obama and the Bush years, and it didn't work, and it won't work now. And so I'm waiting for that moment, unfortunately, when it just becomes so embarrassing that politically here they're forced to step back into the posture that we saw in the Trump administration, of which, of course, I was a member. I should disclose that.
well, Mary Kissel, 6 or 7 weeks ago, I went to my college's 45th reunion, and one of the panels included a China professor from Harvard Center on China, a law school professor who had served in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, and a business school professor. And they were all very optimistic, but they insisted that we turn off the tape and it not be recorded. And we had 2 audience participants, one China-born American naturalized citizen who said, this is bad news, this guy is jailing Jack Ma, et cetera, and one Taiwanese-born naturalized American citizen saying, not to worry, they'll never attack Taiwan. The 3 panelists were otherworldly appeasers. And I just don't know if we can, the sunk costs in academia are too great for people to realize what's going on. Is anyone open to changing their mind on the facts on the ground that you have presented so well in these Stevens letters and through the Nixon seminar?
Well, look, Harvard has taken quite a bit of CCP-backed money, and Xi Jinping's daughter went to Harvard. And it has unfortunately degraded the credibility of the institution on China. I think forever. I just don't take anything that they say seriously. I think the good news, Hugh, is that there is a bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill. Friends of ours in Britain have finally woken up. Tom Tugendhat, who's been a friend for a long time, he's running their security services. He's closed all the Chinese police stations in Britain. Our friends in Australia woke up way before we did, banning Huawei and rooting out corruption in their legislature and also in their universities. That's been a very public debate down there. I worked a lot with the Australians when I was in the administration. So the tide has turned, and I don't think it's going back. I think, as I said, I think the Biden attempts at appeasement are useless. I think there's some hot money going into China right now because they see a short-term opportunity with shares there on the Hong Kong exchange, but it's not a long-term play, and you can't look at that kind of hot money and say, well, that's the trend. It's the sunk costs. It's the big manufacturing money that you have to look at, and we only hear about the Fortune 100, Hugh, because they're big and they're in the news. And they, have sunk so many billions of dollars in there. It's going to take them a long time to diversify or get out. But all of the companies below that, and there are tens of thousands of them that are exposed to China and the United States, they get the message. And
Mary Kissel, last
already that
question.
know.
Chairman Mike Gallagher of the Select Committee on Engagement with the Chinese Communist Party is a member of the Nixon Seminar along with you, and he's on this show a lot. But they don't get nearly enough attention. How would you raise their profile? What should they be doing to get more attention on their work, which is bipartisan and is focused on the danger presented by Xi and the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, when I worked for the Secretary of State, I always encouraged him to go out and talk to everyone. You can't go on friendly news channels all the time. You have to talk, unfortunately, on the mainstream stations. You have to physically get out in front of people, and the audiences at least want to hear your message. That's where you have to go. And so, go to Harvard and do an event there, at a place that's backed by the CCP at these types of centers, or the University of Maryland, which has a huge communist Chinese presence, or Stanford University, which has had long affiliations in China, or Johns Hopkins SAIS, another one of my alma maters, that has a Nanjing Center. Offered to go to China and talk to the Chinese people. That's the biggest thing that he could do, is to say, I'm going to stop talking to this totalitarian regime, and I want to go talk to the people and let them say no. And if they say no, go to Taiwan and talk to Chinese emigres there.
That's a great idea.
Right? It's not a matter of just talking to friends. You have to really, I mean, who do we really care about here? We care about the Chinese people and their relationship with us. And we want this regime, this enemy regime, gone. That should be our goal.
Mary Kissel, that is a great message. Come back again, and thank you for joining me this morning. Mary Kissel is on Twitter, and if you're a investor and you want some advice, Stevens is the place to go and get Mary Kissel's advice.